Hey, class. Been running a bit late, but I'm finally getting you all the lecture for Chapter 16. Chapter 16, as your book mentions, is what's known as the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is the period, let's say, from about 1870, 1890 or so. And this is a time when America really undergoes a very fundamental transition. Now, as you all know, the book starts off with the ending of the Civil War. And so that means that the old plantation economy of the South has been wiped out. Now, cotton production goes back in, but, cotton never really dominates the economy. The never is as big in the national economy as it was, you know, in the pre-Civil War period. Because as the book mentions, once the South gets involved in the Civil War, Great Britain in particular, which was the biggest market for cotton, they start getting cotton from Egypt, which was controlled by the Ottoman Empire at this time. They get cotton from India, which was part of the British Empire. They get cotton from Brazil. They get cotton from a number of places. And this is an important thing that really is kind of at the background for the next couple of chapters with agriculture, is that as we get into the latter part of the 19th century, agriculture becomes more international and becomes more commercial. This means that whereas in the beginning of the 19th century, you had commercial farming, but the majority of farmers, they primarily were self-sufficient. They had some crops that they produced for money, but farmers pretty much looked to survive off of their own food production. A lot of them, they made their own clothes, so on and so forth. But we see farming really become commercial, like it is nowadays, where farming revolves around cash crops and farmers expect to sell stuff on the market. Now, the other thing, as I mentioned too, is like, with with new technology like steamships and railroads, and also towards the end of the 19th century, you have things like refrigeration coming into existence. It becomes much easier to sell agricultural products all over the world. Like I say, especially by the end of the 19th century, when you have refrigeration, you can sell meat anywhere. I mean, Argentina, for instance, becomes a big international supplier of beef because they can slaughter animals and, put them in refrigerators and send them to Europe, send them to America, so on and so forth. And so, that's one of the things that I want you all to understand is, like, when we talk about stuff like populism, one of the things to understand is that, although farmers blame the railroads for their problems, the problems actually go deeper than that. It has to do with internationalization, the fact that the economy is becoming a world economy, where, the United States is connected to Europe, which is connected to Asia, it's connected to Africa, Latin America, so on and so forth. And so this means that agriculture in particular is really affected by this in a negative way. And this is something we're going to see. But anyway, not just agriculture is affected, but really the reason we call this period the Gilded Age is that, the Gilded Age was a term that Mark Twain came up with. Because when something is gilded, it means this was a common practice in the 19th century, where you might take an object, like say a watch, for instance, that's made out of, say it's made out of copper, or maybe it has some, brass, some kind of metal that's not going to rust. And, they might put a very, very thin layer of gold on it. The gold is almost worthless, but, it's enough gold that it's shiny and it looks nice. And that's gilded. In other words, gilding refers to something that looks really nice and shiny on the outside. But once you get beneath that little thin layer, there's very little value. And what Mark Twain is referring to is what Eric Foner is talking about in this chapter. Especially in the very beginning of the chapter when he gives the example of the strike at Homestead, the Homestead iron factories in Pennsylvania. That, you have a situation where the people on top, somebody like an Andrew Carnegie, or like the film that I gave you on John D. Rockefeller, where these people became incredibly rich. Like the film I showed you mentioned that, when you adjust for inflation, John D. Rockefeller is still the richest businessman of all time. Even richer than Jeff Bezos, the guy who runs Amazon, is right now. And so the Gilded Era was a period in which you had an intense concentration of wealth in just a few hands. And the majority of people did not really get a benefit from it. Now, in all honesty, the period that we're living through in America right now is a sort of a Gilded Age. In that, once again, we're seeing really intense concentrations of wealth in the hands of a few people. However, there are some really big differences between the Gilded Age of the 19th century and the situation we're in now. Because in the 19th century, America was a young country with a really new and growing economy. And, America still has a dynamic economy, but, we're not a young country on the make anymore. The situation we have now is a different situation. And, I'll let some sociologists or economists talk about that. I'm a historian. I'm talking about old dead folks. And, that's where I have an expertise. So I'm going to stick to that. But anyway, the point to be made is that after the Civil War, the North, which had always been, much more interested in business and especially had always, pushed in industry and, industrial capitalism much more than the South, it dominated the country. And so this domination manifests itself in a number of ways. Like I say, first of all, you have these big businesses, people like, they give the example of Andrew Carnegie, who was excellent at vertical integration, and which is an important term, something that might pop up on the first test, the term vertical integration. That's one of those things you might want to remember. And vertical integration was the sense that, as an iron guy, as a steel manufacturer, he wanted to control every bit of the process. He wanted to control those iron mines out in Minnesota. He wanted to control the shipping or the railroads that carried it to him. He wanted to control everything that had to do with his industry. Now, the other person that's also mentioned, is John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller, as the film mentioned, is a great example of horizontal integration. And like I say, once again, that's one of those terms that, you might want to remember. I might put that on the test. Maybe I won't. But, hey, even if I don't put it on the test, it's one of those things in life that you want to remember. If you're a business or an econ major or something like that, it's going to come up again. But anyway, horizontal integration is the idea of, he was, Rockefeller was an oil guy. He basically bought every other oil company he could. By the time you get to the early 20th century, John D. Rockefeller owns 90% of all oil production in the United States. He far and away has the biggest oil company in the country. And, like that film I showed you the other day showed that, even with the breakup of Standard Oil, 115, 110 years later, the companies that broke up out of Standard Oil are still some of the absolute biggest oil companies in the world. If you put them all together now, they're still very, very dominant companies. And so, Rockefeller laid a foundation that's still very powerful to this day. Now, in order for big business to achieve what it did, a number of things happened. Now, as the book mentions, some of the biggest changes that took place were in the West. In particular with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1868. You have the Northern Transcontinental Railroad. If you remember that film I showed you on, the film I assigned you guys on Native Americans in Buffalo, remember there are two Transcontinental Railroads. There's a southern one, there's a northern one. And what that did is that it really changed the nature of the United States. First of all, prior to the railroads, if you tried to cross, prior to the railroads, it was quicker to get in a boat to get in a ship and sail all the way around the southern tip of South America, go all the way around Tierra del Fuego, down there in southern Argentina, all the way to the south end of the Atlantic Ocean, almost to Antarctica, and then turn around and go north up the Pacific Ocean to the American West Coast. It was quicker to do that than it was to get in a wagon or get on a horse and ride, say, from New York to San Francisco, or say go from Charleston, South Carolina, to San Diego, California. I mean, it was quicker to get in a ship and sail 13,000 miles than it was to get in a wagon and go 2,500 to 3,000 miles by land. Now, once the Transcontinental Railroads are built, and, this takes a lot of labor. In particular, the book mentions Chinese immigrants. And, the Chinese immigrants first start coming over, during the gold rush and stuff. But they really end up playing a really crucial role in the development of the Transcontinental Railroads. But the thing is, once those railroads are built, it then becomes possible to go from the East Coast to the West Coast or vice versa in a week. Instead of being in a wagon, taking 3 months or even getting stuck. There's a famous story about a party, I can't remember the name right now, that got stuck in that got stuck in Colorado over the winter. And, they got snowed in the mountains. They ended up having to eat each other. Now, they didn't kill each other, but they waited till folks died. And then, they had dinner. And because they didn't have any options. I mean, that's how brutal it was crossing the country. But like I say, once the railroads get built, you can go across the country in a week. And this really changes things. Because, you see, prior to this, and this is something that Fauna talks about a bit, prior to this, the West was very sparsely populated. Now the thing about it is that the northern part of the West, the Louisiana Purchase, that was bought by Thomas Jefferson, in 1803. The southern part of the West was taken from Mexico. First, the United States, gets Texas, then the rest of the West, the rest of the Southwest, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, California, Arizona, New Mexico, all that is acquired during the Mexican American War, 1845, 1847. And so prior to the railroads, the West was occupied by, a very disparate group of people. You had a lot of the original Spanish-speaking, Latinx communities that were in the West. And Anglo whites in the eastern part of the country, did not see them as quite the same as them. I mean, they didn't have the, they didn't have the low status of, say, blacks. They weren't slaves or anything like that, but they weren't really seen as equals. And as the book mentions, when these states, a lot of these areas, when they were still majority Latinx, there was not a lot of desire to make these places states. Now, you also had some white groups that went west, and, one of the most significant ones, of course, were the Mormons. The Mormons have this start, Joseph Smith was from New York State. He gets visions and, he develops a new type of Christianity. And, interestingly enough, the Mormons, a lot of their history takes place over here in Illinois and also in Missouri. And but eventually, because they were seen as really a kind of a cult, really that's how they were perceived, because, they had very, very different understanding of heaven. They practiced polygamy, which was seen as really, really, kind of, for lack of a better word, other Christians saw that practice as a deviant practice. And so therefore, They were subject to violence, lynching, that kind of thing. So eventually they end up moving out to Utah, and they end up settling in the Great Salt Lake Valley area, which was a lake bed. Back during the Ice Age, you had Lake Bonneville, which was this huge, huge lake that existed in that area. After the Ice Age, it dried up, and the remnant is the Great Salt Lake. And, that's why the Great Salt Lake has such a high concentration of salt, because it was this great big lake that dried up, and you have water that comes into the Great Salt Lake that really doesn't have an escape route. And so it ends up just drying up, and so you have this really high concentration salt lake, kind of like the Dead Sea in Israel, same kind of thing. But anyway, they end up moving there. And so you have, groups like the Mormons there. And then also, especially in the plains areas, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Nebraska, you have the Plains Indians, like the film I showed you, these were people who were buffalo hunters. And as the film mentions, they had undergone a revolutionary change about 100 or so years, or maybe 120 years before the railroad, because horses from the Spanish, ended up, moving into that area, and the Indians, being smart people, figured out pretty quickly that riding horses was a whole lot better way to catch buffaloes than having to walk behind buffaloes and crawl on the ground with buffalo hide on, so you can get close enough to shoot it. You get you a good fast horse, it's faster than the buffalo. You can ride up on the buffalo, you have a whole quiver full of arrows, shoot that buffalo and you kill it. And and then also you got big old strong horses help you drag that carcass back to the village. And so this made a huge change in the lifestyle of Indians. Now, also another thing happens too, as you have trade going into the area, Indians also get guns. Not large numbers, but they get them on occasion, which helps them become even more efficient hunters. And so you have a situation where, by the time you get into the 1860s, you have the Plains Indians who have made significant changes in their lifestyle that made their traditional way of following the buffalo and hunting much more efficient. They are now coming up upon a situation where you have lots of people coming into the area now because you have railroads. Once you get railroads there, this means that you can have commercial farming. Because, if you have a farm close to the railroad, this means that you can ship your stuff, anywhere you want. And, like I mentioned before, you have the populist movement that eventually comes up because, farm prices decline throughout the 19th century. And, really do a lot of declining in the 20th century for that matter, too. Now, like I said, the populists blame the railroads, but as I said before, railroads are just they are part of the problem. But like I said, more than anything else, agriculture really suffers from being kind of sucked into international economics that was, really probably beyond the vision of a lot of family farmers. They had a hard time understanding that the whole world had changed on them. But anyway, to get back to what I was talking about with the Plains Indians, you have all these farmers coming in, like you have the Government Homestead Act. The government also made a lot of land really cheaply available to the railroads and other companies. And these railroads they made money selling land to farmers. Like I say, once again, this has a lot to do with the farmers looking at the railroads the way they do. And so they bring all these folks in here. And what we see is over a period of about 30 some years, from a say like the 1855, 1857 until 1890, you see conflict developing between the settlers and the U.S. government and Native Americans. And eventually the Native Americans, they are overcome. Like they mentioned, Ulysses S. Grant, who was a successful general during the Civil War, he ends up, like Fona says, he ends up applying the same tactics that were used to defeat the South, to defeat the Native Americans. He destroys their sources of food. He cuts off their access to things that they want to do. And eventually, one by one, these tribes or these native nations are destroyed. They are defeated. And so, like I said, by 1890, I say 1890 because, that's when you have the massacre at Wounded Knee. Like if you remember the film I showed you, at the very end, they show the Native Americans doing the ghost dance. This was the dance that a prophet had told them if they did that dance, then their ancestors would come back and give them protection against the whites who had come in and occupied the land that had been theirs for thousands of years. And, after the defeat at Wounded Knee, I mean, that was the absolute end of any kind of Indian autonomy. And so what we see is that, like I say, within a generation, the Intermountain West, because, the West Coast had developed earlier, really going back to the 1840s with the California Gold Rush. California had become a heavily populated state, and to this day, it's a big state. I mean, California, about 1 out of every 8 Americans lives in California right now. And so it had grown up. But what we see is that the area, say, from Kansas to Nevada, or from Minnesota to Montana, or, to eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, that's the area that really develops in the period from the 1850s to about 1890. Now, at the same time, we see all this action happening in the West. We see that in the South, as like at the end of the last lecture, we mentioned that Reconstruction ends, and black political life in the South, begins to die. And so what we see is that, by the time we get to the end of this period, by the time we start getting to the 1890s, you start to see the development of segregation and Jim Crow. Now, that really doesn't become totally codified until about 1900 or so. But it definitely is starting to develop during this time. And you also begin to see the development of, terrorism and mass violence, especially in the form of lynching and in the form of mass incarceration, where basically all kind of stuff became illegal, vagrancy, public drunkenness. There were cities in Georgia, for instance, where you could do time for eating peanuts on the street, all kind of crazy laws that were basically designed to arrest as many black men as possible, put them in jail, so they could be put to work, maybe, rented out to farmers. Like for instance, in South Georgia, a lot of prisoners were put to work tapping pine trees in South Georgia to get turpentine that was, used for industrial purposes. And so what we see is that although slavery ends in a kind of indirect kind of way, some of the things that states like Mississippi and Florida attempted to do with the black codes in 1866 and 1867 are achieved through mass incarceration. Now, similarly, in the North during this period, this is the low point for industrial workers in America. At this point in time, industrial workers, unless you're a very skilled worker, unless you're some kind of mechanic or technician, this was a terrible time to be a worker in America. Your wages were low. Like Fauna mentions, there were a number of instances in which workers were forced to accept pay cuts. Now, that will change towards the end of the 19th century, but we're not quite there yet. Now, at the very end of this period, you do see some attempts at reform. You see the 1883 development of Civil Service Law, 1890. You see the development of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Like the film I showed you on Rockefeller talks about how The Sherman Antitrust Act comes out in 1890. But it's really not until about 1911 that we see the federal government get the goods on Rockefeller and force the Standard Oil monopoly to break up. And so, what I want you to know is that, this is really the period when capitalism, big business really consolidates its power in America and, really becomes dominant in all regions of the country. And, we really see industrialization, the modernization of transportation, in particular the railroads, working to unify the entire country and to unify the country as an economic unit. And we see those kind of like those last areas of independence, like the Plains Indians or like the Mormons in Utah, they are pushed aside. And you see a unitary national economy and national transportation network and national economic system being developed and really being dominated by big business. Well, anyway, class, that's going to be it for now. I'll have another lecture for you guys probably ready Wednesday evening. And take care. Like I said, we'll move on to chapter 17 by the end of this week. Take care.